Wyatt Hale only meant to buy a piece of broken land and build a repair shop. $8,000 later, the single father walked away with a scorched estate, 14 supercars buried under decades of dust, and a private jet that every official record insisted had burned to nothing 17 years ago. When Vivian Blackwood stepped into that hangar, she barely glanced at the cars. She looked at the tail number on the jet and went completely still. That aircraft was supposed to be ash. The evidence that made her father a traitor was supposed to be gone with it. Stay with this until the end. What Wyatt uncovered in that hangar will bring an entire empire to its knees. The county tax auction was held in a strip mall conference room with folding chairs and a projector screen that kept flickering at the corners. And Wyatt Hale sat in the back row with a single sheet of notes, a cup of coffee going cold in his hand, and nothing in his mind except the dimensions of a hangar he had never seen in person. He was 41 years old, had spent most of those years with his hands inside machinery that other people trusted their lives to, and had exactly $11,000 in a savings account he had been building since his daughter, Harper, was 9. The first 2 properties went to developers, the third to a hotel chain, and the fourth to a man in a suit who did not bother to inspect anything before he raised his paddle. Then the county auctioneer called Vale Estate, and the projector showed an aerial photograph of a property so far out in the Nevada desert that the nearest gas station was 40 minutes away by highway. The main house had suffered a partial fire and stood with blackened walls on its east wing. The electrical grid had been disconnected. The well had not been tested in years, and an outstanding environmental review flagged potential contamination from abandoned fuel lines running beneath the property. The county was selling the land, the structures, and whatever contents remained inside, with no warranty on any vehicle, document, or equipment found on site. And every professional in that room had already crossed Vale Estate off their list because the cleanup liability alone could swallow the value of the land twice over. Nobody raised a paddle. The auctioneer waited, cleared his throat, set the opening bid at $8,000, and Wyatt raised his hand. Nobody moved, the gavel came down, and Wyatt Hale became the owner of 7.5 acres of desert, a burned mansion, and a steel frame hangar he had spotted in the aerial photograph the moment the projector flickered to life. He called Harper that night from a truck stop diner 3 hours outside the city, and she asked him what exactly he had purchased for nearly every dollar they had. He told her the hangar had a clear span roof, poured concrete flooring, and roll-up bay doors wide enough to pull a small regional aircraft through. She was quiet for a moment, then said she hoped it did not also have scorpions, and he said he could not make that promise. She laughed, which was the sound he had been working toward since the auction ended, and they talked for another 20 minutes about her enrollment forms for the community college program starting in the fall. 2 days later, he drove out to the property with bolt cutters, a work light, and enough food for a week, and the main house was worse in person than in the photographs. The fire had taken the east wing down to the concrete slab, and the rest of the structure smelled of dust, rot, and something chemical he could not immediately identify. The hangar stood exactly as the aerial photo suggested, untouched by the fire, its corrugated steel walls intact, its foundation dry. What he had not expected was the locking mechanism on the main bay door. Because every other entrance to the property was secured with basic padlocks that bolt cutters made short work of. But the hangar door was sealed with a multi-stage mechanical system, interlocking steel bars, a counterweight assembly, and a pin tumbler arrangement he had not seen outside of a museum dedicated to Cold War infrastructure. It took him 4 hours, and when the door finally slid on its tracks and his work lamp swept across the interior inch by inch, the light revealed shapes that did not belong to any abandoned property he had ever seen. Low to the ground, wide at the hips, draped in heavy canvas gray with age and thick with Nevada dust, 14 forms arranged in 2 parallel rows leading toward the rear wall of the hangar. He pulled back the cover from the nearest one and found a body panel unlike anything in any production line he had ever studied, a shape that had never appeared in any showroom or auction catalog, and when he checked the second car and the third and the fourth and found the same, he walked to the rear wall and counted the numbered positions painted there in faded paint. 15 positions marked, 14 spaces occupied, and the 15th, closest to the back partition, empty. Wyatt spent 2 full days examining each car without touching their mechanical systems, moving through the hangar with his camera and a yellow legal pad, noting every external detail, every panel seam, every material texture that struck him as unusual, because he had learned early in his career that the most destructive thing a person could do to an unknown machine was rush it. These were not production vehicles modified for performance. They were hand-built originals constructed with materials he associated with aerospace work. Carbon composite panels bonded, at tolerances he had last seen on aircraft fuselage sections, aluminum alloy subframes machined to a precision that would have been expensive even for a commercial jet program, and suspension geometry that suggested a purpose beyond speed or luxury. Each one wore a serial plate stamped with a designation running from V01 to V14, and every manufacturer logo, every brand identifier, every chassis stamp that might have traced them to a known company had been systematically removed, the absence of those markers documented as carefully as the presence of everything else. On his third pass through the hangar, he noticed a 1/4-inch gap at the base of the rear partition, consistent with a panel that slid rather than stood fixed, found the release mechanism behind a false electrical box, pushed it, and the wall section rolled silently aside on a rail system that had been maintained with oil not long before his arrival. Below the main floor level, a ramp led down into a second chamber carved into the desert bedrock, and there on a cradle assembly of welded steel and rubber pads sat a mid-size business jet, its wings detached and resting on padded frames, its surfaces covered in years of accumulated dust, but its airframe completely intact. No fire damage, no structural compromise visible anywhere in the beam of his work light. No sign that this aircraft had experienced anything more dramatic than a very long sleep. He walked the full length of it slowly and stopped at the tail, and the registration number painted on the vertical stabilizer in standard black characters read N1414BW. He spent an hour that evening pulling records from aviation databases on a satellite hotspot, and what he found was a retirement filing dated 17 years earlier. Total loss of the aircraft in a reported hangar fire, no fatalities, and a detail that stopped him. The fire had occurred at the same time as the largest scandal in the history of Blackwood Aeronautics and Motorworks, and the destruction of this particular aircraft had been cited in the subsequent investigation as evidence that key data from the company's most classified development program had been deliberately eliminated. The aircraft had a name in those filings. It was referred to internally as the program keystone, the one asset that carried the master authentication for everything else Vesper had built. And its loss had been used to argue that without it, the full scope of the alleged theft could never be forensically reconstructed. Whoever had written that argument had never considered that the aircraft might not be gone. He called the county records office the following morning to confirm the terms of his purchase, and the clerk confirmed that the sale had transferred all contents to him at auction, though vehicles with disputed ownership histories could be subject to third-party claims. He wrote down the name of a lawyer he had used during a workplace safety dispute 3 years earlier. That afternoon, while checking the condition of the V-14's instrument panel, he accidentally completed a circuit in the secondary power system, and a single amber indicator light blinked on above the center console. glowing quietly in the underground chamber for 4 seconds before the connection timed out and the panel went dark. Wyatt circled the note twice on his legal pad and went back to work. 340 miles away, a server rack that had not registered an active ping in 17 years received a signal, logged a timestamp, and sent a notification to a single monitored address. The convoy arrived before noon the following day, 3 black SUVs moving in close formation down the unpaved access road, trailing a column of desert dust that was visible from the hangar door a full minute before the vehicles stopped. Vivian Blackwood stepped out of the lead vehicle in a charcoal suit that was entirely wrong for the heat and the terrain, which Wyatt took as a sign that she had not planned this trip so much as executed it the moment a server alert landed on her screen. She was followed by a man she introduced as Dean Rourke, her chief legal counsel, and 2 individuals carrying hard cases with the look of technical assessment equipment. She identified her company, told Wyatt her name, and asked him to open the hangar immediately so she could confirm whether the property contained assets belonging to Blackwood Aeronautics and Motorworks. She did not phrase it as a request. Wyatt said she was welcome to look at whatever was visible from the exterior, and that if she wanted to enter, she would need to produce documentation establishing a legal claim or a court order. When she offered him $100,000 to vacate the property before sundown and surrender any claim against every vehicle and piece of equipment inside, he said no, because no CEO flew to the middle of a desert to offer 6 figures for property she could recover through the courts for a filing fee, and the gap between those 2 numbers was telling him everything he needed to know about what was actually stored inside. She accepted his inspection terms, and they entered together. Inside the hangar, Vivian walked the 2 rows of covered vehicles with the focused attention of someone cataloging rather than discovering. She did not appear surprised by what was under the canvas, and when Wyatt released the rear partition and the wall slid aside, she descended the ramp alone without being told that was where the aircraft was. He pulled the canvas back from the tail of the jet, and she stopped as though the air had gone solid in front of her, the color draining from her face in a single breath as she looked at the registration number painted there. She had been 12 years old the last time she sat in this aircraft, and her father had explained the tail number to her himself. 14 for the number of prototypes in the Vesper program, and 1414 for her birthday, so that any time she saw it in a flight log she would know it was his. She walked the full length of the fuselage and climbed into the cockpit without asking permission, and when she came back down, several minutes later, her voice was level, but the quality of the silence beneath it was different from the controlled quiet she had carried into the hangar. She told him there was a detail on the co-pilot's seat, a stitching pattern in blue thread along the headrest seam that her mother had chosen when the interior was installed, a specification that existed in no production record because it had been a private edition and there was no way to replicate it without knowing it had ever existed. Before she reached the bottom of the cockpit steps, she paused, read something etched into the underside of the instrument panel housing in lettering too small to see from the seat, and said it aloud quietly, "Truth flies twice." She turned to him then and asked whether he had accessed the data vault embedded within the aircraft systems, and when he told her he had not known it existed, she said that was the first genuinely good news she had received in longer than she could easily estimate. The offer changed the following morning, $1 million becoming 5 during the first hour of conversation, and 5 becoming 10 by the time Rourke finished drafting terms on his tablet. Vivian presented the revised figure with the air of someone who considered the matter settled. $10 million for the full property, all contents, and a signed statement that Wyatt had never personally accessed any data stored within the vehicles or aircraft. He looked at the number for about 4 seconds, then told her he would like to understand why a company with the legal resources of Blackwood was not simply filing a theft recovery action if the property had been taken illegally. And she said the situation was complicated. He said that every situation looked complicated when the simpler version was inconvenient, and after a long pause, she told him. 17 years earlier, a fire at a private airfield had destroyed a hangar containing equipment belonging to Blackwood's most classified development program, a project called Vesper, involving high-performance ground vehicles and associated avionics systems. And in the investigation that followed, her father, Alistair Blackwood, was found to have transferred $180 million out of company accounts into a network of external entities and to have deliberately orchestrated the destruction of Vesper assets to conceal the diversion. He resigned, faced civil proceedings, spent the remaining years of his life in voluntary isolation, never publicly contested the finding, and died without being cleared. Amos Vale, the lead engineer on Vesper and the last owner of this estate, had testified briefly in the early stages of the inquiry and then vanished from public life entirely, dismissed by the press as an eccentric with a grudge who had nothing credible to offer. Wyatt said he was sorry about her father. She said she did not need his sympathy, and he said he knew she did not but meant it regardless. He told her he was willing to allow a supervised technical assessment of every vehicle and the aircraft, conducted jointly, with a complete copy of any recovered data provided to both parties simultaneously, and with his own legal representative present throughout. And he would not be transferring any vehicle or aircraft until ownership was established through proper legal channels. He said those 3 conditions were not negotiable, and she should not take his willingness to cooperate as any indication that he was confused about who currently held title to the property. Vivienne agreed to the terms without visible resistance, which told him she needed access more urgently than she needed control. They began that afternoon, working vehicle by vehicle with a methodical patience that Vivienne watched in silence for the first hour, before asking where he had trained. He told her 8 years as a test systems technician for a regional aircraft manufacturer, followed by independent restoration work after he refused to sign a safety certification for an aircraft that had not completed its full test protocol and was encouraged to leave shortly afterward. She said she had spent 17 years making decisions she believed were necessary to protect a company she was increasingly unsure deserved to be protected. He said that sounded like a harder problem than his. In the 6th vehicle, a short audio recording was embedded in the root directory of its storage module, less than 90 seconds, the voice of an older man speaking with deliberate calm into a handheld recorder, saying that whoever heard this message should understand one thing clearly: do not trust the person who put you in the chair. He looked at Vivienne. She was already looking at the door. The work settled into a pattern over the following days, and the pattern revealed a design that Wyatt began to recognize once he had opened the 4th and 5th cars in sequence, each vehicle configured differently, not randomly but according to a logic that Amos Vale had constructed with full deliberate intent, the 14 machines together forming a distributed archive where each held one piece of a record that required all 14 to be present and intact before any complete picture could emerge. The first 4 held engine test records from the Vesper prototype trials, raw performance data of the kind that established a vehicle's developmental origin beyond any legal challenge. The 5th through 8th contained patent filing records and technical correspondence, the paper trail of an intellectual property chain that had been publicly claimed as lost in the fire. The 9th, 10th, and 11th held financial transaction logs organized with a precision that spoke unmistakably of a man preparing a formal evidentiary package for proceedings he expected would come decades later. The 12th and 13th contained internal communications, memoranda, encrypted messages, and a handwritten letter photographed and stored digitally, its physical original presumably long destroyed. The 14th held a series of audio recordings made by Alistair Blackwood himself, each dated, each addressed directly to his daughter by name. The jet N1414BW was not a storage unit but a key. Its onboard computing system contained the master encryption sequence that would, when all 14 vehicles simultaneously transmitted their authentication signals, decode the entire archive into a single integrated file set, cross-referenced and time-stamped and organized with formal legal proceedings clearly in mind. Amos had spent 17 years in this desert not hiding from the world, but assembling the case that Alistair had never been permitted to make, piece by piece, vehicle by vehicle, in a language that only the right pair of hands would know how to read. Midway through the 5th day, Wyatt found a composition book behind a false panel in the workshop section of the hangar, its cover warped by heat and age, its pages densely filled with handwriting. And the final page carried a diagram showing all 14 vehicles arranged in an arc around the jet, with connecting lines drawn in red ink and a note in the margin that read, "No single machine holds the whole truth. To wake the bird, you must first wake the entire herd." He handed the notebook to Vivienne and watched her face as she read it, and the expression she wore was one he had not seen from her before. Not grief exactly, but something adjacent to it, the look of a person assembling a picture they had spent years trying not to see clearly. That evening, while cross-referencing recovered documents in the main house, Vivienne's phone rang, and Wyatt could hear from across the table a man's voice, measured, warm in the practiced way that power learns to be warm, telling her she should leave the property immediately and let the legal team handle recovery, that Amos Vale had been a disturbed individual and that the man who now owned the estate was likely using the situation to extract money from the family. After the call, Wyatt said he needed to check the exterior security system, walked the perimeter, and found a secondary transmitter attached behind the east gate post, not part of the system he had installed, pinging at intervals consistent with the frequency Conrad Blackwood's legal team would have used on site, small enough to miss, and placed low enough to avoid any casual inspection. He photographed it without removing it, came back inside, wrote what he had found on a piece of paper, and slid it across the table. She read it, looked up without any expression he could name, and said they should not correct the impression that the transmitter was still working. The county inspector arrived the following morning with a clipboard and a set of placards citing structural safety concerns. A risk of roof collapse based on a report filed the prior evening by an anonymous engineering firm that Wyatt had never heard of, the file number logged at 11:47 the previous night, less than 9 hours before enforcement was attempted. Wyatt stood at the gate and asked whether same-day action based on an anonymous third-party assessment was standard county procedure, then said he would be calling the county sheriff to verify the chain of authority before he opened any gate. The asset recovery company that arrived behind the inspector, carrying paperwork claiming a lien against the vehicles on behalf of Blackwood Aeronautics and Motorworks, a lien registered only the night before, withdrew to the road when the sheriff's deputy arrived, reviewed Wyatt's auction documentation, and confirmed that the lien required independent judicial review before it carried any enforcement authority. Inside, Vivienne sat with her back against the hangar wall and said she understood what Conrad was doing. He was trying to gain physical possession of the vehicles before their systems could be fully activated, because once the archive was opened and verified by independent parties, the chain of custody would be unbroken and the evidence unimpeachable. But if he could get the vehicles onto a company transport under a disputed lien, they would disappear into a private facility and never surface in any form useful to anyone but him. By noon, she had quietly dismissed Dean Rourke from the property with a false errand, and Rourke thanked her with a smoothness that confirmed everything and left without meeting Wyatt's eyes. After which Vivienne called him with a detailed and entirely fabricated update, feeding Conrad incorrect information about what had been recovered and what remained locked. It was the most deliberate deception she had practiced in years, and she executed it cleanly, and when she ended the call, she sat for a moment with the phone in her hand and said nothing. Wyatt did not mention that it had been well done. Wyatt called Mara Keene that afternoon, a financial forensics specialist he had worked with during the safety dispute that had ended his career at the manufacturer, and gave her the company names from the financial records in V9 through V11. She called back within 4 hours to confirm that every entity listed as a recipient of Vesper patent transfers in the years following the fire traced back to a holding structure managed through a financial intermediary in a low-disclosure jurisdiction, and that the beneficial ownership records available through cross-border treaty access pointed to a single controlling trust registered under a name that was not Alistair Blackwood's. To prevent the data systems from being wiped remotely, Wyatt isolated the entire network from any outside connection, having already discovered evidence that a deletion command had been transmitted toward the vehicles the moment V14 first came online, a command that would have erased everything had the full sequence completed. That evening, while verifying the authentication chain in V07, Wyatt found that its primary control module had been damaged deliberately. The circuit board cracked in a way consistent with a sharp impact rather than vibration or time, and a secondary replacement component installed afterward bore a Blackwood internal supplier code but carried a date stamp 6 months after the fire that was supposed to have destroyed everything. He showed it to Vivienne without a word. She studied it under the work lamp for a long moment, then said this meant Conrad had known the vehicles existed for at least 17 years, had known where they were, had known the evidence survived, and had chosen to leave it buried rather than retrieve it, because retrieval would have required him to explain to the world exactly how he had known where to look. Conrad moved through official channels the following afternoon, and by 6 o'clock, Wyatt had received formal notice of an emergency injunction hearing scheduled for 9 the next morning, after which the property would be placed under judicial hold for a minimum of 60 days, long enough for digital systems to be remotely wiped, for narratives to be installed in every relevant record, for an archive that had survived 17 years to be quietly eliminated in the space of 2 months. The power died at 8:37, not a gradual dimming but a clean cut, and the backup generator cycled once and fell silent because a concealed shutoff valve on the fuel line had been engaged. The valve positioned inside a conduit access panel locked from the exterior with a key that was not on the property. There was no sound from the road, no movement at the gate. The pressure came not from people but from circumstances, from the steady narrowing of time and options in the dark. Wyatt walked to V03, opened the hood, found the auxiliary battery terminal, and began laying out the procedure for wiring a temporary power bus through the vehicle's secondary electrical system, while Vivienne held the work light and moved cables and called voltage numbers back to him in the dark, having set aside the jacket entirely and working with the focus of someone who had stopped measuring the distance between herself and the problem. Around midnight, she said she had spent a very long time believing the only way to lead a company like Blackwood was to become what it required, and that what it required had been shaped, she now understood, almost entirely by the man who had told her that her father was a thief and then handed her the keys. Wyatt said that her father had not buried 14 machines and an aircraft in a desert for 17 years so she could become a more effective version of the man who had destroyed him. He had left them so she could become a different kind of Blackwood entirely. He said it without emphasis, the way a person states something they consider obvious, and returned to the cable he was routing through V05's secondary junction. She did not respond for a long time, and he did not press it, and the work continued in silence until the desert had gone fully still outside. By 2 in the morning, they had a functioning power circuit drawn from the batteries of 6 vehicles, enough to run the primary systems across all 14 cars simultaneously at low draw. And when Wyatt activated the sequence, the indicator lights across all 14 dashboards came on in succession, a slow roll of amber and green moving from V01 to V14 along both rows, while in the chamber below, the jet's auxiliary systems powered up automatically, the avionics bay illuminating in a dim blue wash that rose up the ramp like dawn arriving from underground. The central display on the jet's main computer showed a single file at the top of its directory, named for her, and when Vivian placed her hand on the biometric panel, the system accepted her identity from a reference database that Alistair had preloaded before the estate was sealed, and then the screen displayed a second prompt. The file required authentication from a second member of the Blackwood family. She looked at Wyatt for a long moment, then said she knew exactly who the second authentication was meant for, and that bringing him here was the only move left on the board, and the most dangerous one. The call went out at 6 in the morning. Vivian told Conrad that Wyatt had made contact with a financial press outlet and was threatening to sell documentation of a decades-old internal fraud, and that she needed Conrad on site before the injunction hearing to manage a situation moving faster than lawyers could contain. She kept her voice at exactly the level of controlled distress that he had spent 20 years teaching her to project, and he said he would be there by 10. Wyatt used the pre-dawn hours to make arrangements. Mara Keene arrived from the city with 2 colleagues and established a secure connection between the jet's archive system and an independent forensics server off-site. The county sheriff's office provided 2 deputies at the entrance based on a documented pattern of harassment, and 2 members of the Blackwood board that Vivian had identified as genuinely independent of Conrad's influence were connected via a secure video link on a device entirely isolated from the property's network. Conrad's convoy arrived at 10:15. 3 board members he had brought himself, a legal team of 4, and the particular self-possession of a man who has never seriously believed he would not win. And he looked at the hangar and the vehicles visible through the open bay doors and said with a performance of long-suppressed emotion that it was devastating to see what a trusted colleague had taken from the company, then asked, pleasantly, for Wyatt to be removed from the property. Wyatt said that Wyatt owned the property. Vivian brought Conrad into the hangar and walked him toward the rear partition, telling him the aircraft had a biometric system requiring 2 family members to unlock a critical archive, and that she had already completed the first authentication. Conrad placed his hand on the scanner without apparent hesitation, because a man who has controlled every element of a situation for 17 years does not easily believe the situation has escaped him. And the archive opened. The screen filled with Alistair Blackwood's face. A recording made with professional care and clear intent to last, in which he spoke for 19 minutes describing the Vesper project's financial structure, the patent transfers Conrad had arranged through subsidiary entities, the internal communications in which Conrad had explicitly directed the falsification of records implicating Alistair, and his own decision to absorb responsibility without contesting it, because contesting it would have required exposing financial records that would have drawn scrutiny to accounts held in Vivian's name as a minor, accounts Conrad had arranged precisely to ensure that any investigation of him would collaterally destroy her. The transaction records from V9 through V11 populated a secondary screen in a format that Mara Keene's forensics team had pre-arranged to display against the public financial records Conrad had filed during the original investigation, and the discrepancies between the two versions were immediate and total. Conrad said the video was a fabrication, said it with complete assurance and a calm that would have been convincing to anyone who did not know what was still coming. Then Wyatt activated the jet's flight data recorder archive, running on a protected partition separate from the general systems, and the recording from the night of the fire played through the cabin speakers. Conrad's voice, directing a pilot to transfer the vehicles and burn the empty hangar on a specific timeline, then asking Amos Vale whether all 14 cars had been handled according to Alistair's instructions. Amos had answered that he had done exactly what Alistair asked him to do. Conrad had assumed that meant destruction. It had meant the opposite. In the upper right corner of the main screen, a status indicator confirmed that the full session had been transmitted live to the two independent board members connected from the city. The board members on the remote connection voted to suspend Conrad's authority as chairman within the hour, a motion that became binding the moment it was logged and transmitted to the company's registered legal address, and the independent legal team began transmitting the archive contents to the relevant financial oversight authority as a formal submission, a process that would take months, but that now had an unbroken evidentiary chain to build from. One of Conrad's own board members, the one who had arrived with him that morning, stepped away from the group and said quietly that he wanted the record to show he had not been informed of the nature of the materials on site before attending. Conrad looked at the man for a long moment and said nothing. Conrad attempted one final argument, asserting that all intellectual property within the recovered systems remained the property of Blackwood Aeronautics and Motor Works under the original patent registrations, and that Wyatt's possession of those systems constituted ongoing unauthorized retention of corporate assets regardless of the auction result. He made this argument precisely and without anger, the way a man argues when he knows the position is not strong but has no other ground left to occupy. Wyatt took a document from the inner pocket of his jacket. He had found it 3 days earlier inside the pilot's seat of the jet, sealed in a waterproof case, bolted to the structural frame and invisible unless you were working the aircraft's interior with intent to restore it. A notarized transfer agreement dated 8 months before Amos Vale's death, signed by both Amos and Alistair Blackwood through a legal intermediary, transferring physical custodial ownership of all 14 prototype vehicles and the aircraft designated N1414BW to Amos Vale as a private individual, specifically to protect those assets from unlawful destruction, with a provision specifying that upon Amos's death without a named heir, the assets would become part of whatever property contained them. The property had been sold at county auction. Wyatt had purchased it. The chain was clean. Conrad looked at the document for a long time, then looked at his niece and said he had given 17 years to maintaining a company that would otherwise have collapsed under her father's failures, and that everything he had been done to preserve what the Blackwood name stood for. Vivian said that what the Blackwood name stood for was something she had been understanding in the wrong direction for most of her adult life, and that she appreciated him finally making the correct direction clear. Conrad left the property in the company of the county investigators, walking of his own accord with the careful deliberateness of a man conserving dignity, until he turned once at the gate and told Wyatt that a mechanic in possession of assets worth several $100 million should understand that the world had systems for relieving people of things not suited to them. Wyatt said he had been acquainted with those systems before and found them less effective than advertised. After the convoy had gone, he stood in the middle of the hangar with his hands in his pockets, looking at the 14 vehicles with their instrument lights still glowing at low draw, and told Vivienne that Conrad had 1 point correct. These machines should not belong to a single person. She asked what he had in mind, and he told her, and the independent board member still connected from the city said, without prompting, that the proposal had genuine merit, and the board would likely approve it. The final agreement took 6 weeks to formalize and ran to 40 pages, which Wyatt read in full before his lawyer reviewed it the following day. 12 of the 14 prototype vehicles, along with the aircraft N1414BW, were transferred to Blackwood Aeronautics and Motorworks under 3 binding conditions. The company would publish a formal exoneration of Alistair Blackwood and Amos Vale in every jurisdiction where the original findings had been recorded. Vale Estate would be developed into an independent technical preservation and vocational training center operating under its own board and free from corporate interference in its standards or operations. And Wyatt Hale would serve as operational director of that center, with full authority over safety certification procedures, answerable to the independent board and not to the Blackwood executive structure. He retained V01 and V14 as permanent display assets at the center. Vivienne arranged a legal transfer payment in an amount she described to the press only as a fair value settlement for assets received, a number that Wyatt deposited quietly into 2 accounts, one for the center's operating fund and one for Harper, enough to make the question of tuition something his daughter would never have to answer to anyone's timeline but her own. The estate took 4 months to repair to working condition, the hangar converted without removing its original steel frame, the floor refinished, the bay doors replaced with units that moved quietly on modern tracks, a sign above the entrance reading Hale Vale Restoration Center in the plain functional typeface that Wyatt had specified when the fabricator called to confirm the design. Harper drove out for the opening day, stood beside her father in front of the bay doors, and said she thought it looked like something that would still be standing in 50 years, and he said that was the intention. The aircraft was cleared by a full independent safety review and authorized for its first flight in 17 years on a morning that was clear and cold in the way Nevada mornings are when the season has turned, and Vivienne sat in the co-pilot's seat where the blue stitching ran along the headrest seam, and she flew. Wyatt stood below on the access road and listened to the engines he had spent 2 weeks inspecting, adjusting, and certifying with his own name behind every finding, find their full power and carry the aircraft into a sky that offered no resistance, and when her voice came through the radio it was even and clear. He was right. Truth really does fly a second time. Wyatt looked back at the hangar, at the lights of 14 positions glowing inside the bay, and understood that $8,000 had purchased something that no appraiser could price. The chance to give a name back to 2 men who had kept faith with the truth while the world looked the other way, and to build, on the same ground where the evidence had slept for 17 years, something that no amount of power or money would ever be able to quietly bury again.